Hey everyone! This time we read Gaming the Iron Curtain by Jaroslav Svelch. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I do apologize if I did it incorrectly. This is a really fascinating book, as it covers a lot of the early computer industry in Czechoslovakia. This was prior to the country being split in half and prior to the Iron Curtain falling. I'm going to use a few terms here that are kind of generalizing the region. I'm going to be referring to most of the Eastern European countries as the Eastern Bloc, and then Western Europe, I'm really just going to be referring to it as the West, unless I specifically need to call out a country here or there. So we're really focusing in on Czechoslovakia here, which kind of makes sense. It can be used as a way to really frame the narrative that Jaroslav wants to make. It's a really good, at least, case study for the rest of the Eastern Bloc, as we didn't get into a lot of the video games or the computer industry, with the exception of Tetris so far. And that was really just like a one-off thing, and it didn't really go too deep into the overall computer industry, and it definitely didn't go into video games. I'm going to kind of use video games and computer games synonymously here. I know there is a difference between them, but just for simplicity, I'm going to use video games. I will be calling out a few arcade games, and I will mention that beforehand, just so we're clear on that one. So for the first part of this book, we talk a lot about the hardware that was either made or imported into Czechoslovakia. This is really, really cool because you get to see a little bit of kind of how a controlled economy works, or a planned economy, and basically how it doesn't work at all, especially if the government isn't behind a product. And for the most part, kind of a running theme through this is that the Czech government did not give a damn about personal computers. So a lot of those had to be imported either legally or smuggled into the country. And we'll get into that just a little bit later in the book. For right now, we just want to focus on some of the homegrown computers that were built. And a lot of these were clones of UK computers, mostly because that was where they could get the parts from. It was a little bit harder for them to import parts from the United States. And when I say import, they did not import enough to meet demand, mostly because they didn't care about the consumer market at all. They only cared about using these for improving their economy, so more of like an industrial scale computer. Jaroslav calls out 3 specific computers that are all basically clones of a ZX Spectrum, and one that was sort of built not by the government but by basically an approved factory within Czechoslovakia. All three of these met challenges that were kind of similar and not really unique. It was basically that the government wasn't behind home computers, and I know I've mentioned that a few times already. But they didn't want to import parts for it because those parts were needed for other computers. They didn't want to basically support it because they didn't believe the public needed these computers. That's one of the huge faults for a planned economy. They don't really care about consumer goods at all, and they don't factor in changing markets or anything like that. They really only care about improvements made to the economy. So your consumers don't really get anything. They kind of get screwed. Jaroslav calls out a few instances here where the one computer shop in Prague had like a line of 50 people waiting to get computers, and they waited from I think it was about 12 to 14 hours to get their computers, which they didn't even know were really going to get there. And you could only fit a few people in the store at a time, so they were basically just rotating in and out so that people could go in, get coffee, get warmed up, and then go back to their places in line. It's a really fascinating story, and I wish that had been more in depth. It was really cool to read that part. It's kind of spinning off of the history class. We get a little bit more into like the planned economies and everything like that, and some of what the government thought about home computers. As I mentioned, they didn't want to support these, but they wanted to pay like lip service to it. So they would allow a computer to kind of get started and get it announced to the public through their own different propaganda rags, and they would allow like some consumer interest to at least build for these products before basically pulling the plug on them by not giving the companies that were making these, or really the ministries that were making them, they wouldn't give them the parts that they needed, or they would get inferior parts. So you had a lot of things that were basically not functioning. And when they would get to consumers in maybe like the hundreds, you wouldn't see a huge mass production of these. They would tend to break down, or you wouldn't have the parts that you needed, or there wasn't software to work with them. We'll get into software later on, but right now it's really cool to hear a little bit about the hardware that would go into these. So like joysticks, mice, and anything else that might be needed for these computers to work, specifically with like cassette tapes and that sort of thing. One thing that was really cool with this was hearing that some of the magazines that were made to support the video game industry and sort of the hardware industry in Czechoslovakia, they would publish schematics for you to build your own peripherals and also to kind of modify your own stuff. So there was a pretty big mod scene going on, especially for hardware. And they needed it because a lot of these computers that were cloned were not very good, so you might need to repair them on the fly in your house, because you were not getting customer support in Czechoslovakia, let alone anywhere in the Eastern Bloc at the time. So you had to build your own different peripherals, you had to modify your own computer. It was a mess, especially since if the government couldn't get parts for something, there was very little chance that you were going to be able to go to a store and get parts for your computer as well. And they had to kind of turn to the black market in order to get parts, and a lot of those parts were not necessarily high quality. You're getting a lot of second and third-hand parts coming in. It's really fascinating to read some of these stories about how, you had to build your own joystick if you wanted to play games, you had to modify your cassette tape in order to get it to work properly with your cloned ZX Spectrum, or even your Atari or your Commodore, once those eventually made it into Czechoslovakia. So we get into some of the computer clubs in Czechoslovakia. Now these were kind of a weird thing for me to read about, because they were government-approved clubs, and they were attached to what, at least from what I read, a paramilitary organization that was in charge of all of the clubs in Czechoslovakia. So if there was a hobby that you had that sort of fit into like a pipeline to the military, this club would fall under this paramilitary organization, and computer clubs were one of those. But they weren't really highly regulated by the government, so you would go to these meetings and it wouldn't necessarily have like a government representative there. I'm assuming the secret police had penetrated all of these clubs so that you might have like one or two spies from the government within your club, but they weren't super regulated by the government, so you could get away with a lot of stuff. And this was where you saw a lot of, especially later on when we get more into software, you saw a lot of illegal goods going in and out of these clubs, because they had to have like the black market go through these things. This was also the distribution center for a lot of newsletters from these clubs, and a lot of sort of the different non-government magazines. And it was here where you saw a lot of pushback on sort of the government's take on the computer industry, especially after the government came out and said telling the public and the people that were asking for these, you don't actually want your home computer because you don't know what you're going to do with it, and there's no reason for you to have them. The only thing that matters are like the ones used for like automation for industry and everything like that. It was really amazing to read these clubs trying to push back and the government just totally ignoring them, which makes a lot of sense for a communist government, where it's like, no, our propaganda is right and you guys are all wrong. You don't actually want the thing that you want. So before we continue on with basically the computer industry, I wanted to call out one really, really interesting thing that I had no idea happened in Czechoslovakia, but I'm assuming it happened all across the Eastern Bloc. And that was like mobile arcades. So instead of going to like a specific building or anything like that to play arcade games, you would basically go to a fair or like a carnival, and there would be what looks like an ice cream truck, but like a little bit bigger. You would walk into this thing, and there'd be like a bunch of arcade cabinets there. Some of them would be like knockoff cabinets. Others would have been smuggled into the country and were just part of these carnivals, because they were run by a lot of what are essentially nomads or other carnies and whatnot. This is like so amazing to me. I wish there were more pictures of these. At least I haven't found very many yet. There are a couple in the book. They look absolutely bizarre. I mean, just imagine, I just had like images of like the ice cream man coming around, stopping, like opening up the door and dropping like a little like a walk ramp for people to walk up, go into his truck and play arcade games. That's really kind of what it sounds like. It's just absolutely amazing. A lot of these arcade cabinets were brought in on the black market, just like the computers, and you tended to get like second and third hand arcade cabinets as well. And you needed to have people to come and repair them. And they mention a few of the repairmen in here, especially one that he just made it his job. Like, he quit what he was doing and would just go to like these different carnivals and fix their arcade cabinets for them. It was absolutely amazing, and just like a really, really awesome story in this book. I honestly think like these mobile arcades should be the subject of their own book. Just that would be really, really cool to read. So the last bit of this book is about the video games that were made in Czechoslovakia. Jaroslav mentions that there are about 200 to 300 games that he could find that were made at this time, and he really focuses in on the ZX Spectrum, mentioning there is about 90 to 100 games for that system made. So these were not all original games. This total includes like hacks of games, ports to different systems. So if you had a game that was exclusive on the Atari 400 and it was ported over to the ZX Spectrum, Jaroslav counted that as an individual game, which kind of makes sense because it would have been coded in Czechoslovakia, which met his criteria for games made at this time. So a lot of these games were actually done on audio cassettes, or at least close to what an audio cassette used to be. It's kind of a cool format because it was pretty easy for them to copy it. They do go into whether they were done on digital copies or they were analog copies. The analog ones would have been just simply copying from one cassette to another, and those tended to break down. Jaroslav mentions you really only got like one good copy, and then the copy of the copy would have been largely unplayable. Now, the digital ones were a little bit more straightforward. You copied the data from the cassette onto your computer, and then you copied that onto another cassette. Those, I'm pretty sure, were more stable than the analog ones. I don't remember if he mentioned that in the book or not, but I'm just sort of assuming that the digital ones would have been more stable. Jaroslav gets into how a lot of these protest and activist games were the developers' way to sort of express their own frustrations with the communist regime. A lot of these developers were younger kids, so probably in like their late teens, early 20s, and this was just how they wanted to express themselves. This was a government that didn't really allow freedom of expression until much, much later, basically in the late 80s, and even then it was still kind of clamped down on. So by making these games, it was sort of these developers' way to like rebel against the system, that sort of thing. And these games were essentially distributed through the informal network that we talked about much earlier, through the computer clubs. And you really had to be like well, you didn't have to be, but it was really done through a lot of the youth that were getting these games, because Jaroslav mentions the older developers didn't really care about video games. They didn't really see that as important. They were more interested in doing different things with computers. And so you had a lot of the younger developers, this was their outlook, their way to, sort of express their own dissatisfaction with their government, test their skills, and kind of work their way through the hobby. So I probably should have mentioned this at the very beginning, but I'm going to bring it up here. Reading this book reminded me an awful lot of reading some of the books for like a 4,000 level writing intensive history class. And I kind of had a few flashbacks of going through that. I wish I had this book when I was getting my degrees, but I didn't. I really would have loved reading into this. This would fit perfectly into like a Cold War history class or something along those lines. It's really, really a fascinating book to read. So, if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. I will talk to you guys later. Have a great day, everyone.